One thing I really love about the winter season is the fog, especially when you're able to be above it. That's the perfect place to capture calming landscape images. So in this video I want to show you my approach of shooting this scene above the fog. First, we will go over the light conditions. Then I'll explain the camera settings and of course the composition, and finally, as always, I'll show you the post-processing for the final image. The right light always plays a huge role in getting good images. During golden hour we get a gorgeous golden light, and due to the sun's position in the sky, it creates some nice contrast in the waves of the fog. As the sun gets lower, we will lose that contrast. But shortly after sunset is, when in my opinion at least, you will get the best colors for a scene like this, with these nice pink and blue hues. But it's always worth to wait a good while longer after sunset, because the colors still can get super intense, so don't pack up too soon. Of course, the same goes for sunrise. Be there on location a good hour earlier and just shoot an image every now and then to capture all the different colors of the sky. Once the sun is too high up in the sky, the scene might get too contrasty with harsh shadows and, due to the nature of the fog, super bright highlights. And that's usually not what we want as landscape photographers. What I love to do when I'm above the fog is to make the sea of fog look silky smooth, just like I do with waterfalls, for example. And we can achieve this effect by using longer shutter speeds. The only difference is water coming down a waterfall is fast, so an exposure of just under a second is already enough for the desired effect. In this case, however, the fog is moving rather slow, so we need to increase the shutter speed. I started with a 180-second exposure, for which I need a strong ND filter because otherwise the image would end up overexposed. But I quickly dialed it back down to 30 seconds since this was already enough to reduce the structure in the fog. And just for comparison, here's a shot from the same spot with a short shutter speed. You see, in this image the fog has way more texture, and which to me this makes the image kind of lose its calmness. What shutter speed I choose highly depends on the subject or the landscape I'm shooting. For example, on this mountain scene I wanted it to look dark, grim and dramatic. I wanted the fog to have more texture to emphasize that effect, so I went for a shorter shutter speed instead. As the light was slowly vanishing, I kept the exposure at 30 seconds. That means I had to get rid of the ND filter and adjust aperture and ISO to counter the fading light and keep a nicely balanced exposure. Here, it's a good idea to keep the histogram of your camera activated so you can always check it for over or under exposure. One thing that also really helps bringing these images to life is using a polarizing filter. As you can see here, when I turn it, this filter will reduce reflection and it makes colors a little more saturated. But always pay close attention to the sky depending on the direction we are photographing and the focal length we are using. We might end up with an ugly bending effect, which we want to prevent. I ended up shooting the scene with two cameras. One at roughly 100mm to have the road in the foreground leading into the fog and kind of pointing towards the mountains in the distance. The longer shutter speed also helps capturing the cars going up and down the road, so we get this cool light effect on top. I felt like the mountains in the distance were a bit too small, so at some point I just decided to also go a little closer on these mountains. I set up a second camera shooting the scene at around 200mm, which cuts out the foreground, and I ended up only with the fog and the mountains in the distance. This shot is lacking a subject, and it would have been a wonderful image with something in the foreground, like for example a church tower peeking out of the fog. Unfortunately, this was not the case here. But the great thing about the longer focal length is it doesn't only make the mountains look bigger, but as we get closer to the fog, the waves increase in size as well, giving us a bit more to look at. Plus the effect of a longer shutter speed is more visible on longer lenses, so we can see the motion of the fog a little bit better. In the end, I prefer the wider shot as we have this nice leading line, and in general there is just more going on than just the fog and the mountains. And of course, now it's the time to take a look at the post-processing. As always, feel free to follow along by downloading the RAW file from the link in the description. For the editing of this image I will be using Photoshop, but you can do pretty much most of this in Lightroom as well. So right away what I want to do is to change the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Neutral. If you don't have this profile, you will find it under the Browse menu, and here in the Adobe RAW profiles is where you will find the Neutral profile. This will give us a very flat image to work with, so what I want to do next is to open up the Lights panel and I want to work on the exposure. At the moment this is a rather dark scene, so to fix that I'm going to bring up the exposure quite a bit. I'm also going to bring up the whites, since looking at the histogram you will see we do have some room to play around with. I do hit a bit of clipping in the highlights, but you can see it's in the car lights in the foreground. I don't think it's a problem if these areas are slightly overexposed. Then I want to get rid of that clipping in the darkest areas, and I do that by bringing up the blacks a little bit. This will also help introducing a softer, dreamy look on this image. And finally, I want to restore a bit of contrast, therefore I'm going to bring down the shadows. This will not only help introduce contrast, but it will also make this road in the foreground pop out a little more because of that added contrast. At this point I think I want to crop the image, so let's do that real quick. I also don't think it's perfectly straight, so I want to rotate it first, and let's take out part from each side here. And this is looking good. Okay, then after adjusting the exposure, let's work on the white balance in the color tab. I want to make it slightly warmer without losing too much of that blue tones in that fog. So I'm going to bring up the temperature just a notch, introducing more of these sunset colors this way. Right around here looks good to me. I can always go back to it if I want to change it further. Now, since we are using the Adobe Neutral profile, the colors are lacking. So we are going to counter that by bringing up the vibrance, and I'm also going to bring up the saturation for that purpose. The image might have a slight purple color cast. You could fix that using the tint slider, but I don't think it matters at this point. As I said, we can go back later on if it is too much. Then let's open up the effects panel. I want to introduce a bit of texture, making the image look sharper. Since we're using the neutral profile, I want to pump up the clarity for some more extra contrast, and I'm also going to increase the dehaze for more contrast as well. So these were the basic adjustments. Let's compare to before real quick. The image is much brighter. We do have more details in the darkest areas, and the colors are slightly different as well. Now we want to do some more local adjustments, and we're going to do this with masking. So let's open up the masking panel. I'm going to start things with the radial gradient. Let's make a smaller one like this. I'm going to place this radial gradient outside the image, and what I want to do with that is to add some light coming in from the right side. So we want to slightly tilt this radial gradient to fit the direction of the light. And to create this effect, I'm going to bring up the blacks. I'm also going to slightly drop the dehaze, and then let's introduce some temperature to make this particular area warmer. Okay, I want to keep it subtle, so I think that's enough. I also want to use a linear gradient coming down from the top because I want to make the top part of the sky slightly darker, and I'm doing this by bringing down the exposure. Let's also bring down the temperature just to add some more blue tones to the darker part of the sky like this, and that's it. Then I also want to work on the fog. Therefore, let's create a more complex mask. I'm using a linear gradient first. I'm covering pretty much all of that fog coming up from the bottom part. Of course, you need to mask out the foreground. Now, we can approach this in different ways. What I want to try first, I want to subtract using an objects selection, and I'm going to draw a rectangle around the whole foreground. Sometimes this works, in this case it didn't work of course, so we need to find another way to do that. So let me subtract a luminance range mask and I'm clicking somewhere in the darkest parts of the foreground like this. This is working much better, but we need to adjust this luminance range mask a little further. So maybe like this. That's looking pretty good. I want to further subtract a linear gradient just to be safe. And let's see if this works. What I want to do is I want to pump up the contrast just a little bit to make those waves more visible. I'm also going to use some clarity for the same effect, and this will really help to introduce structure here. So I'm happy with the foreground for now. What I want to do is to further work on the sky. I'm going to use the sky selection, and I want to intersect this selection with a radial gradient. So let's click on those three dots, go to intersect mask width and choose radial gradient. Then let's drag this up and I'm going to place it right here on the right side. Let's make it a little bigger. I just want to kind of target the horizon and make this a little brighter to add further contrast between the sky and the mountains. And to do that, I'm going to bring up the whites just like this. Wonderful. I also want to make those mountains in the middle part pop. So again, I'm using a radial gradient to kind of target them very roughly. Since we don't want to include the sky, we need to subtract it. So let's click on subtract and choose select sky. All I'm doing in here is to add some more clarity, and this helps to make these mountains pop a little more. Alright, then let me create another sky selection. I'm going to use this to make the sky look warmer, but I don't want to affect the cold part of the sky, so I'm subtracting a linear gradient coming down from the top like this. And what I'm going to do in here is to bring up the temperature. I still don't like the colors of the sky, so I want to further tweak it using the tone curve. Here I'm going in the red channel, and what I'm going to do is to introduce more red tones in the red channel by picking up this point and slightly drag it to the left. This is looking lovely. Now I also want to head into the blue channel and introduce more yellow. Again, I'm picking this point for the highlights and I'm dragging it down. And this way, you'll see we are introducing this really nice color tone for the bright part of the sky, kind of separating it more from the mountains in the distance. One more thing I want to do, let's create another sky mask. And then I want to invert this sky mask by clicking on this icon right here. And I want to subtract the brush and I want to get rid of that road right here. So I'm not happy with the saturation of the foreground, so I'm going to reduce it a little bit with this mask, just bringing down the overall saturation a bit like this. And that's it for the masking. Let me turn off all the masks to see the difference from before to after. Very subtle changes, but it really helps to improve this image. Now let's do some color grading, and I'm going to start in the color mixer. I do want to work on the hue, and the first thing I'm doing is to bring down the yellow hue all the way. This will mostly only affect those car lights in the foreground, making them look just a bit richer in my opinion. What I'm going to do as well is to bring down the purple hue, which will reduce the purple color cast, which I mentioned earlier in the editing process. So bringing down the purple hue will introduce more natural blue tones this way. Now let's head over into the saturation tab. Here I want to bring up the red saturation for the sky and the car lights. I also want to bring up the orange tones again for the sky and the car lights, and the yellow tones for the same effect. I do think I want to bring up the blue tones just to make them a little richer. Could bring up the purple tones as well. Maybe we want to head into the luminance tab and bring down the blue luminance, which will add more contrast to the image by making the blue tones of the image darker. Just need to be very careful to not overdo it, but I think right at this point looks great. I can deactivate the color mixer so you can see the difference from before to after. Let's continue in the color grading tab with a bit of split toning. Let's start with the highlights, which we want to keep warm. So we want to set up the hue, introduce a warm color tone this way. I'm going with a red tone right around here, and I'm going to pump up the saturation. Wonderful. To not overwhelm the image with these warmer tones, I'm going to use the shadows and the midtones and introduce a cold color tone to balance things out. So let's go into the midtones, set up the hue, I'm going with a cyan-ish color tone right around here, and I'm going to bring up the saturation just a tiny bit. This should be enough. And let's go into the shadows, set up the hue first. Again, I'm using a cyan color tone, and let's bring up the saturation a little bit. And finally, let's head into the calibration tab as always. And what I'm going to do is to bring down the blue primary hue. This will shift the blue tones and the warmer tones. Keep that in mind when working in the calibration tab. And I'm going to bring up the saturation to make the colors stronger. Now there's only one thing left to do, and that's the sharpening. So let's open up the details panel, bring down the radius, increase the details all the way up. And we want to hold down the Alt key while adjusting the masking slider so we can nicely sharpen the important areas of the image like this. And now let's bring up the amount of sharpening, and we are done with the raw adjustments. Now there are a few sensor spots, and I also want to apply some nickel action filters. So let's open up this object. First, I'm going to get rid of these sensor spots using a spot healing brush. I will clean the camera very soon. I'm just too lazy to do it right now. Alright, that's looking good. And let's do the nickel action thing. I'm going to the filter menu, go to nickel action and choose Color Effects Pro 4. This, by the way, also works in Lightroom if you have this plugin. This is a paid plugin, but it's super useful. And on the right side, you can already see what I have done for this image. So let me turn off all these filters. First, I started with the classical soft focus effect, which, as you can see, will add a dreamy look on top of this image. We could make it a little stronger maybe, and maybe bring down the brightness a notch like this. Next, I added the Brilliance Warmth effect, which adds a bit of saturation and a little bit of warmth. And finally, I'm using the polarization filter just to add a very tiny amount of contrast to the overall image. Nothing fancy for this image, but it makes the whole thing look a lot better. And with that out of the way, let's hit OK. And that's it for editing this image. Let me know which one of these two images you prefer. And also let me know if videos like this are helpful for you, because I'm always not sure if I should continue showing the capturing process as well. Anyway, I'm looking forward for your comments. So thank you very much for watching this video, and see you all next time.